Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to be in Holyoke once again, post-COVID. I see we have a hybrid live Zoom program that we're doing here. This is new for me. I've been doing the Zoom for the last year or so and have gotten used to staring at the little white light on my laptop. So this is kind of different. I'm doing this and presenting live. So it's quite an interesting thing here. Okay, and there are people coming in. Okay, so I developed this lecture because I have always loved the 1920s. Have you ever thought of, if I had a time machine, what period of time would I go into? I think the 1920s is up there. Maybe the Gilded Age as well would be something I'd want to go into, maybe the late 1890s. Now, I don't think I'd want to go into the Middle Ages. We don't want to run into the plague or anything like that. So I picked times that are very interesting, I think. This is one of them. So we've been doing this for a few years, and it's quite an interesting little presentation here. And I think what you're going to find is that there are things that you learn in this presentation that you didn't know about. Because what do you think about when you think about the 20s? You think about, oh, prohibition and bootleg and you know, doing the Charleston and some of the movie stars. That's kind of about it. But there's a lot more to it. There was a lot more going on in the 1920s. So let's get started here. So really, a lot of people look at the 1920s and they say this is an age where America kind of loses its innocence. Now, if we look here, the United States of America, it was just coming out of World War I. And just a little background, we declared war on Germany in 1917. American soldiers under John Pershing arrived in large numbers on the Western Front in the summer of 1918. During the war, the U.S. mobilized over 4 million military personnel, and we suffered 110,000 deaths, including 43,000 due to the influenza epidemic that was going on. A lot of people don't remember the influenza epidemic because people didn't talk about it much. And I now know why, because we've gone through COVID. And after COVID, I don't want to talk about it again. So that's probably why you didn't hear much about the influenza epidemic back then. Now, the thing is, once these men returned, they returned to a country that was geared for the war. All the factories were set up for war. In many nations, especially in North America, economic growth continued even during World War I as nations mobilized their economies to fight the war in Europe. After the war ended, the global economy began to decline because everything was told for the war, and then they had to go back to a peacetime economy. In the United States, in 1918 and 1919, they saw a modest economic retreat, but in the second part of 1919, we saw a mild recovery. A more severe recession hit the United States in 1920 and 1921 as these men were starting to look for jobs and trying to get back into the regular swing of American life. And what we start to see after this is a lot of labor unrest. And these are some of the high points that happened. And I know this is 1919, but this is leading into the 1920s here. Now, we had the Great Steel Strike of 1919, which was an attempt by the weakened Amalgamated Association of Iron Workers and Tin Workers to organize the United States steel industry in the wake of World War I. Shortly after Armistice Day, the AFL organizers in and around Pittsburgh began to be harassed by steel companies. Permits for meetings were denied, meeting halls could not be rented, Pinkerton agents stopped organizers at train stations and forced them to leave town, and literature was seized. Now, the AFL held a National Steelworkers Conference in Pittsburgh on May 25, 1919. Disillusioned employees began to abandon the labor movement. Worried committee members, seeing their chance to solidify membership gains, agreed to a strike referendum in the mills in August. The response was 98% in favor of a general steelworker strike, and it took place on September 2nd, 1919. Steelworkers were forced to carry out their strike threat. The September strike shut down half the steel industry, including almost all the mills in Pueblo, Colorado, Chicago, Illinois, Wheeling, West Virginia, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, Lackawanna, New York, and Youngstown, Ohio. The steel companies had seriously misjudged the strength of the workers' discontent. The post-war Red Scare had swept the country in the wake of the Russian Revolution of October 1917. The steel companies took eager advantage of the chance in this political climate. In Pennsylvania, state police clubbed picketers, dragged strikers from their homes, and jailed thousands on flimsy charges. After strikebreakers and police clash with Unionists in Gary, Indiana, the United States Army took the city on October 6, 1919, and declared martial law. The National Guardsmen, leaving Gary after federal troops had taken over, turned their anger on strikers in the nearby Indiana Harbor, Indiana. Steel companies also turned towards strike breaking, rumor mongering to demoralize picketers. Between 30 and 40,000 unskilled African Americans and Mexican Americans were brought to work in the mills. Company officials played on racism and many white steel workers by pointing out how well-fed and happy the black workers seemed to be now that they had white jobs, quote unquote. Company spies also spread rumors that the strike had collapsed elsewhere, and they pointed to operating steel mills as proof that the strike had been defeated. On October and November, as the time wore on, many AA members crossed the picket lines to return to work. AA affiliates collapsed because of the member infighting this caused. Unions on the National Committee squabbling, and jurisdiction steel mills publicly accused each other of failing to support the strike. The Great Steel Strike of 1919 collapsed on January 8, 1920. The Chicago mills gave in at the end of October. By the end of November, steel workers were back on their jobs in Gary, Indiana, Jonestown, Youngstown, and Wheeling. So the strike was broken. Now, this was just the beginning of it. Here's one that's a little bit closer to home. Maybe some of you have heard of this one. In 1919, the police affiliated with the AFL, the Boston police affiliated with the AFL, and the police demanded a pay raise. The city of Boston refused and suspended 19 officers for union activity, and the police went on strike as a result, September 19th, 1919. Burglaries, looting, and rioting broke out in the streets of Boston. There were crap games going on the street. Young gangs of youths were running rampant throughout the city. It was a lawless city for about 3 days. You can see some of the vandalism here. Here's the crowds in the streets, no police. And it was just bedlam for 3 days. Here's a cartoon showing what's going on here. By then, eventually, Governor Calvin Coolidge calls out the National Guard to restore order and later replaces the striking officers with new recruits. Here they are. So the strike in Boston was broken. Here's another shot. Some police stayed on the job, some did not. Okay. Now, Calvin Coolidge said he originally hoped to reinstate the officers, stating in a telegram to the labor convention, "I earnestly hope that circumstances may arise which will cause the police officers to be reinstated." Over the objections of Mayor Peters, Commissioner Curtis announced on September 13th that he planned to recruit a new force. He fired roughly 1,100 and hired 1,500 to replace the striking officers from a pool of unemployed World War I veterans. And here you have some pictures of those folks that ended up being fired. Now, on February 6, 1919, Seattle shipyard strikers went on strike. Shipyard workers went on strike. Now, what they did in Seattle, they did what we call a general strike. You don't see this much anymore. A general strike is when one area goes on strike and a whole bunch of other businesses and factories do strikes in sympathy of the shipyard workers. And this is what happened. It was a general strike. So it shut the city of Seattle down effectively. And here you see, here's some photographs from that period. All the workers basically walked off their jobs, and the people of Seattle were not very happy about this. Here we have some pictures from that period. Now, as I said, the strike was unpopular with the general public, and the specter of Bolshevism was used again. And as you see here, union activity was compared to what was going on in Russia with the Bolsheviks, the communists taking over. There was a strong connection there. So the general public was not really in favor of this strike. And eventually, Mayor Ole Hansen called in federal troops. Hansen threatened that the government would take over all the jobs of the strikers. The public hailed his defiant stand, and the strike was crushed within 6 days. So this is how the 1920s, we went into the 1920s with a lot of labor unrest, fear of Bolshevism, communism, and we end up with what we call the Red Scare. I referred to this earlier. Maybe some people aren't aware of what this is. Basically what the Red Scare was it was this fear that there was going to be some kind of a Bolshevist or communist uprising in the United States. Now, the Russian people had rebelled during the First World War, touching off a firestorm that would bring about the threat of communism. The death of a czar and the family and murder of millions of people. This scared and frightened people in the United States. They were afraid that it was going to happen here. Now, the revolution was led by Vladimir Lenin and other communist agitators, as you can see here. We had our own homegrown agitators at that time, and here are just a few of them. And when you hear the word Red Scare, people lumped all these radical groups into one group, the Reds. And what they were referring to here, they were referring to several radical groups. You've got the communists, socialists, and the anarchists. And a couple of these groups had nothing in common except for they were radical. They were fringe movements. So the American people had a bit of a fear of this happening over here. And you can see by these photographs, these people are doing essentially the same thing that Lenin was doing, demagoguery in public. So there was a great fear. And there was a fear that there would be violence at some point, that there would be some kind of revolution. And that fear came to fruition. In April 1919, approximately 30 booby-trap bombs were mailed to a wide cross-section of prominent politicians, including the Attorney General of the United States, justice officials, and financiers. People like John D. Rockefeller among the prominent names. Now, the thing is, they mailed all these bombs out. Most of them were intercepted. The only person to be injured was a maid of one of these men. She didn't know that the package, it was like a package marked simply. Her arms were blown off. But this was traced to a group of anarchists out of Boston. In 1919, the Galleanist anarchists managed to blow up also 8 large bombs nearly simultaneously in several different U.S. cities. So people are seeing this, and they're starting to have a fear, kind of like we have this fear of terrorism today. And it comes to a fever pitch when this happens. The homes of Mayor Harry Davis in Cleveland, Judge W.H.S. Thomas, Massachusetts State Representative Leland Powers, Judge Charles C. Knott of New York, and the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, who had already been previously targeted, were all attacked simultaneously. If you look here, this is Palmer's house, and he was about to call it a night. He was about to sit down in his bed, and all of a sudden, bam, this bomb exploded on his front door here. And what happened, there was one of these anarchists was carrying a bomb to place on his doorstep, but he fell on the bomb, blew himself to smithereens, and only shook up Palmer. But this was kind of the last straw after this. And Palmer flew into action. And what he did was he started to round up all these foreign radicals that were agitating. And this is an actual newsreel footage of some of those people being rounded up. Yeah. And it was very swift. They rounded up all these people, put them on ships, and sent them back home without any kind of hearing. If they were on a list, and they called this the Soviet Ark. And this is because of this great fear of radicals. And here are some more cartoons showing this as well. And because they were Reds, obviously, they must have, they figured that they would like life over in communist Russia. So no matter where they came from, they just put them on the ship and shipped them to Russia. Also, we have a new president, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, actually, his vision for post-World War I, the 14 points, the basis for the proposed League of Nations, was kind of shot down. He was very much involved in developing the League of Nations, and he was one of the architects of it. But when the treaty came back to the United States to set up this League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations, it was rejected by the Senate. And this is because we enter a period in our country of great isolationism. And the thinking was that we had gotten involved in this war over in Europe, and it cost a lot of money, blood, and treasure. And now we want to just stay out of it. So we basically withdrew into ourselves, and we stopped getting involved in national politics. Also, another thing that was happening was there was a great rise in the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the 1920s saw a major resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this was not the old Klan. Now they were going after not only the former slaves, they were going after Catholics, Jews, and also immigrants. And this was the new Klan. And this was also, this xenophobia was rife in America at that time too. And here's a picture, of course, their race. Here's a picture showing how popular it was in the 1920s. In 1924, there were 4 million members of the Ku Klux Klan nationwide. Here's another one. This is an actual newsreel from Washington, D.C. The Ku Klux Klan, at its height of popularity, here at Washington, D.C., had more than 30,000 members march They were racist anti-Semites marching 22 abreast, 14 rows deep, and they paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington on August 8th, 1925. This is frightening. This was America in the 1920s. Also, due to this, from 1920 to 1929, there were 280 documented lynchings of black men. And some of these images were actually turned into postcards. And you can see the people here posing alongside these lynchings. So this was America in the 1920s. So there was a great spike in migration coupled with radicals led to a great fear of immigrants, and a massive backlash ensued. Here's some of the cartoons that were in the paper. Anti-immigrant, anti-radical. Here's another one. The melting pot. This great melting pot that we talked about, what this country was. And there was a movement to change the immigration policies. And they did do that. And immigration did go down during the 1920s. Now, we got a new president. He was elected, and that was Warren Harding. Ran for Republican nomination for president in 1920, but was considered a long shot before the convention. When the leading candidate would not garner a majority, the convention in deadlock supported Harding. He was nominated on the 10th ballot, and the system was a little bit different from the one we have today. He conducted what he called his front porch campaign, where he would actually just come out every morning and give a speech from his front porch. And here is his house today at 38 Mount Vernon Avenue in Marion, Ohio. He allowed people to come to him. He promised a return to normalcy. Let's get back to normal. The pre-World War I normal was what he was talking about. And he won in a landslide over Democratic James Cox to become the first sitting senator elected president. Harding was sworn in on March 4th, 1921, in the presence of his wife and father. Harding preferred a low-key inauguration without the customary parade, leaving only the swearing-in ceremony, a brief reception at the White House. In his inaugural address, he declared, "Our most dangerous tendency is to expect too much from the government and at the same time do too little for it." So just as Harding was coming in, this was happening. Prohibition. Oh, I love that picture. The temperance movement in the United States can trace its roots all the way back to colonial days. It didn't start in the 1920s. Numerous cities and towns had voted to ban alcohol. The American Temperance Society formed in 1826 and began lobbying for a nationwide prohibition of alcohol. A resolution calling for a constitutional amendment to accomplish a nationwide prohibition was introduced into Congress and passed by both houses in December 1917. By January 16, 1919, the amendment had been ratified by 36 of the 40 states, making it law. On October 28, 1919, Congress passed the enabling legislation known as the Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment when it went into effect in 1920. And when it went into effect, this is what happened. All the booze was dumped down the drain. You can see here, of course they're showing up for the newsreel, but these are prohibition agents flushing it down the drain. Now, almost immediately, a black market sprung up, a black market of providing alcohol. Stills started popping up everywhere. A A small still was used to ferment a mash from corn, sugar or fruit, beets, even potato peels to produce high-proof alcohol. Then they mixed it with glycerin, a key ingredient, a touch of juniper oil as flavoring. To turn this highly potent liquor into rank gin, they needed to water it down by half. But their bottles often were too tall to fit under the spigot in the kitchen sink, so they used the bathtub. This is where the term bathtub gin comes from. But few could tolerate the bad taste of this bathtub gin. And here we have Jimmy Cagney in the movie The Roaring Twenties making some bathtub gin. And a lot of these, if it was made wrong, people, if you read the papers back then, if it was made wrong, people would get poisoned. You'd see whole groups of people who were drinking this stuff get poisoned. And of course, we had the rum runners. Rum running was when ships from Bimini and the western Bahamas transported cheap Caribbean rum to Florida speakeasies. This is how it started. However, rum's cheapness made it a low-profit item for rum runners, and they soon moved on to smuggling Canadian whiskey, French champagne, English gin to major cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, where the prices ran high. It was said that some ships carried $200,000 in contraband in a single run. So you could see this was a profitable business. Now here's an interesting image here. This is showing how they actually, on the Canadian border, I guess they could slip it across a river by kind of put it in a barrel, and one side would pull it to the other and they'd bring it up. So this was one ingenious way of smuggling booze across the Canadian border. You can see here. Here's a newspaper image showing a group of men ready for a delivery. They've got the scout ready looking for the prohibition agents of the police ready for that delivery. And this is probably what that delivery looked like. Much like our drug smuggling today. And this in effect, when this law went into effect, it made most of the people in the United States criminals because most of the people didn't stop drinking. They kept on drinking. In fact, alcoholism actually went up during Prohibition. And then we have the speakeasies. Here's a typical speakeasy. Speakeasies, though illegal, were numerous and popular during the Prohibition era. Here's you have the little quintessential little lever in the door, the little slit, the window where you go up and you knock on the door and somebody looks out and you know, the cliche is Joe sent me. And that's how they screen people to come in. Here's another one. That's how you could get into the speakeasy. Or you had a secret password or something like that. Now, I was able to find several images of major speakeasies. Would you think that's a speakeasy? They were well hidden. They were in grocery stores in the back room, places that looked like, I think this looks like a deli. You go in the back room, there's a bar. An apartment building. Here's another one, like an old shut down storefront. Doesn't look like anything's going on there. And this is one I located not too far from here. This is the Mount Vernon Hotel in Worcester. And if you ask nicely in the bar, they'll take you down to the basement and show you where the speakeasy was. And that's where the speakeasy was. Here's some photographs. As I said, alcoholism or drinking alcohol did not stop during Prohibition. The speakeasy soon became one of the biggest parts of American culture during this time. Several changes happened as speakeasies formed. One was integration. People of all races, black or white, would gather together and even mingle. People would mix together and have few or no problems in this environment here. And here's some more pictures. These are actual speakeasies. Kind of looks like the hotel bar we just saw. And here's another one. And there were several personalities that emerged during this time. And one was Texas Guinan. So Texas Guinan was interesting. Another change that occurred was more participation by women. Many businesses would set up speakeasies to attract women to get more profit. Women also began to insert themselves into the business of speakeasies. Texas Guinan, who was a former screen and stage actress, opened many speakeasies during Prohibition, such as the 300 Club, the El Fanon in New York City. And Guinan had this quintessential greeting that she would give people when they came in. She would, as they came in, she'd say, "Hello, suckers," as they came in, and they'd be admitted to her speakeasy. Now, what she'd do is she'd open a speakeasy, and then they'd get raided, they shut it down, and they'd move across town and open up another one. Here is one of her biggest customers. This is the mayor of New York City, Jimmy Walker, who had his own booth in several of her speakeasies. And of course, like I said, they generally were ill-kept secrets, and owners exploited low-paid police officers with payoffs to look the other way, enjoy a regular drink, or tip them off about planned raids by federal prohibition agents. So there were raids, but a lot of them they would know when they were coming. In fact, I don't know if you've ever been to the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire. They have a bar in the basement, and they would station somebody in the front of the hotel, which has this long, long driveway. And if the cops were coming up the driveway, they'd signal the bar, and the whole bar would switch around, and they'd hand everybody teacups. So by the time the cops got in, everyone was sipping tea. So some of these were pretty elaborate. And here we have some of these raids that would happen. Yes, everybody's youth is a dream, a form of chemical madness. F. Scott Fitzgerald. And of course, you can't talk about the 20s without the gangsters. And here we have, in New York, it started out with these two guys. Initially, the gangs of New York were penny ante operators, knocking over push carts, stuff like that, cheap extortion rackets. They were known as the Black Hand. They would extort businesses and street vendors, running gambling and brothels. That all changed when Prohibition came along. Organized crime became organized. It became big business, making millions selling bootleg hooch. And the photos you see here are two of the old mustache pizzas, they'd call them. They were the old line mafia, or Black Hand as they called them then, and they were replaced by guys like this. Lucky Luciano, who was not about the ethnicity. A lot of these early gangsters, if you weren't Italian, they wouldn't associate with you. Lucky Luciano was about money, not ethnicity. The mafia joins forces with other ethnicities, although they didn't make them so-called made men. They associated and worked with them, especially the Jewish gangsters. Here you have Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who is kind of the muscle of the outfit there, or I should say the combination, as they called it. And they called him Bugsy because if you turned him the wrong way, if you got on his wrong side, he went Bugsy on you. And you never called him Bugsy to his face either. And the money man, the man who knew all the numbers, was Meyer Lansky, master mathematician. If he had just gone into business, he probably could have made millions legitimately, but he turned to gambling and crime. These folks were the originators of Las Vegas. They're the ones that eventually in the 1940s would start Las Vegas. And because of this, we end up with what we now call the 5 crime families in New York City. I like to say, if it had not been for Prohibition, you would not see this. These gangs probably would have dissipated, new gangs had come in, but it was Prohibition. They made millions of dollars. They got very powerful in the United States. And it really wasn't discovered until the 1950s, the amount of power that they had. And we also have Chicago. Now, the Mustache Pete in Chicago was a guy by the name of Big Jim Colosimo. his racket was pimping in brothels. Now, Big Jim invited a gentleman by the name of Johnny Torrio from New York City to deal with extortion demands from the Black Hand. So I guess the Black Hand was actually extorting the mafia here. Torrio eliminated the extortionists and stayed on. He ran Colosimo's operations and organized the criminal muscle needed to deal with the threats to them. In 1919, he brought in this young man. This is Alphonse Capone, who also left New York for Chicago at the invitation of Torrio. Capone began in Chicago as a bouncer in a brothel. And that's probably about the time he came in. That looks like a young Al Capone. Now, when Prohibition went into effect in 1920, Torrio pushed for the gang to enter into bootlegging, but Colosimo balked. For some reason, he didn't think that this would be profitable. And you can guess what happened to Colosimo. On May 11th, 1920, Colosimo was murdered. And it was probably by this guy. Capone was thought to be one of the assassins, and shortly after the murder of Colosimo, he was elevated to Torrio's number 2. And then in January 24th, 1925, Torrio was returning from a shopping trip with his wife Anna when he was shot several times. And at this point, he decided to resign. After recovering, he effectively resigned and handed over control to Capone, who at this age he was only 26 at this time. He became the new boss of organized crime and took in illegal breweries and transport networks that reached Canada with political and law enforcement protection. Now, he wasn't the only gang in town. There was also the Irish gang, and it was led by this man. His name was Dean O'Banion. He was an Irish-American mobster who was the main rival of Johnny Torrio and Al Capone during the brutal Chicago bootlegging wars in the 1920s. He led the North Side gang, the Irish. Capone ran the South Side Italian gang. Now, Torrio would later be killed by members of Capone's South Side gang over gambling debts of another Italian gangster owed to O'Banion. And this is how he was killed. Believe it or not, O'Banion's front was a floral shop. And an Italian gangster had just died, so they were having a big funeral. So these gangsters came in to buy flowers, and they knew that O'Banion had several pistols that he had on his vests and everything, and they knew they had to somehow disable him. So what they did was one shook one hand and the other grabbed another hand, and one pulled out a gun and they shot him like that. And this is portrayed in the famous movie, The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So this is how it happened to O'Banion. You see the men coming in here. There they get him. So Capone was trying to eliminate the Irish, but he just, all he did was cut off the head. There were still members of this gang left. The Irish combined with a Jewish Jaime Weiss here. O'Banion killing sparked a brutal 5-year gang war between the North Side gang and the South Side gang, or the outfit, that culminated in the killing of 7 North Side gang members in the famous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the murder of several members and associates of the Chicago North Side gang that occurred on St. Valentine's Day 1929. The men were gathered at Lincoln Park, Chicago garage on the morning of February 14th, 1929. They were all lined up against a wall and shot by 4 unknown assailants, 2 dressed as police officers. So they thought they were being arrested, and it turns out that they were being massacred. And this is a shot from that same movie, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Now, Al Capone had a great alibi. He was at his house in Florida, so he was nowhere near the scene. Oh. Okay, Al Capone effectively becomes the king of Chicago. He'd later get put in jail over tax evasion. So President Harding suddenly dies of a heart attack, and Calvin Coolidge, who was his vice president, becomes the president of the United States. Here you have it. And he is sworn in at 2:47 a.m., August 3rd, 1923, at his father's house in Plymouth, Vermont, which I had the pleasure of visiting just a short while ago. And that's the actual room where he was sworn in. That hasn't changed much. Now, Coolidge, who was known as Silent Cal, was a pretty conservative Republican. As you can see, here's one of his famous quotes: "The chief business of America should be business." Now we're full swing in the 1920s, and this is what everybody hears about, the fashions and fads of the 1920s. What would the 20s be without the famous flapper girl? Flappers were a subculture of young Western women in the 1920s who wore short skirts. Knee height was considered short for the period. They had bobbed hair, they listened to jazz, flaunted disdain for whatever was considered exceptional behavior. Flappers were seen as brash for wearing excessive makeup, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes in public, driving automobiles, and treating sex in a casual manner, otherwise flouting the sexual norms of the day. Here we have a good, the poster girl for the flapper here. And this is really, you start to see, this is where we're going from the 19th century into the 20th century. You can see it here exhibited by the flappers. Here's the 19th century haircut, the long hair, and this is what happened. They all cut it off, and they became flappers. And you have the famous bobbed haircut. Here's a few ladies with that style. And you can, if you look around, you can still see that cut today. It's still in style all these days later. And here's the typical flapper with her flapper dress. Now there were the norms were changing. It's, you know, I think every generation says this, you know, oh, these kids these days. Bathing beauties became very popular. This was scandalous because just a few years earlier, if a lady showed her ankle, that was horrible. That was very improper. Now you have ladies dressing in these bathing suits, which we look at it in the age of bikinis and laugh at it. But in the 1920s, this was considered very, very risque. Here you have some more pictures of some of these bathing beauties. Now, some places tried to limit it. Here's a beach where you had to have your skirt at least 4 inches above the knee, and you actually had a guy going around measuring their skirts. And this is what happened if you violated it. You got thrown in the jug. And of course, there were men's fashions too. What we have here is the Oxford pant, which was very popular among college men. We still have the Oxford shirt today, but the Oxford pant, it's not really in style anymore. Maybe it'll come back. Here's another men's style, the raccoon coat. Many college men would wear these to football games, and it was probably because you could fit several bottles of illegal booze in these big bulky coats here and not be noticed. And the style of the times, you had the straw boater hat, you had the fedora. Men had hats back then. It wasn't just a baseball hat or one of those scally caps. That's the only choice you have today. Just look at this crowd here. That's a baseball game, and everybody has a hat, a tie, and a jacket. Today, if you would go to a baseball game, everybody would have ripped up shorts, t-shirts, and they just dressed for, it was a special occasion and people got dressed up. Now, the dance of the time was the Charleston. The Charleston is named after the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The rhythm was popularized in the mainstream dance music in the United States. By 1923, the tune called the Charleston, which originated in the Broadway play Runnin' Wild and became one of the most popular hits of the decade, took the nation by storm. And here's some examples of the people doing the Charleston here. Here's one famous shot of Josephine Baker dancing the Charleston, the Folies Bergère in Paris in 1926. Here's another one. I think I have a video here. Let's see. Think you could do that one? I don't know. Those crazy kids. Now, this is something that actually happened very close to us. This happened in Boston. I kind of just stuck this in here because I thought it was interesting. The Pickwick Club in Boston collapsed July 4th, 1925. It killed 44 persons, making it the deadliest building collapse in Boston's history and the second deadliest in the history of the United States. Now, this was caused by all these people on the second floor, dance floor, doing that Charleston, and just the bouncing up and down caused this floor to collapse and killing all those people. So this is something that happened during the 1920s in our own area here. And also we have the beginning of the dance marathon. Dance marathons are events in which people dance or walk to music for an extended period of time. Marathons could last anywhere between a few hours to several weeks. So this was something that it went right into the 1930s, and it was kind of sad because in the 1930s, people were doing these things to win money because they didn't have jobs. And here's another fad that you probably never heard about. It was called pole sitting. It started with this fella. His name was Alvin Shipwreck Kelly. He's credited with popularizing this pole sitting fad. He sat on top of a flagpole in 1924. Nobody knows why, either in response to a dare or maybe it was a publicity stunt. But he sat on it for 13 hours and 13 minutes to publicize a movie. Now, in 1926, Kelly set a record by sitting atop a flagpole in St. Louis, Missouri for 7 days and 1 hour. In June 1927, he planned to beat that record by sitting on one for 8 days in Newark, New Jersey. He would end up sitting atop the Newark pole for 12 days and on a pole in Baltimore's Carlin Park for 23 days in 1929. In 1930, he set the world record by sitting on a flagpole on the top of the steel pier at Atlantic City, 220 feet high for 49 days and 1 hour. So that's Shipwreck Kelly. And there were other people that got into this. There was one guy that was sitting up there for a number of days, and he only had to get down because there was a lightning storm coming in, and he thought that wasn't a good place to be. Pogo stick came into being this time. And this was a popular fad among the college men and probably the fraternities. Goldfish swallowing was something that was very popular. I guess this is akin to Tide Pod swallowing. Who knows? The crossword puzzle was a new thing. It had just come in. Many people were obsessed with crossword puzzles. And there was also a new board game that many people played called Mahjong. All these things are very familiar to us today, but they were brand new and exciting back then. Now, what was going on in Hollywood? Well, I like to say Charlie Chaplin, for me, was the personification of this golden age of Hollywood. He was the man in the 1920s, the late teens. And here you have him with Jackie Coogan, I believe. And this is an actual scene from the movie The Kid, I believe. And it still resonates today. And even though there's no sound or anything, you can figure out what's going on here. So he's in this rundown room, sends the kid out. Hey, go throw a rock through this lady's window. Oh, no. And who comes along? The glazier. Oh, I just happen to have a window on my back. I think the medium required more creativity than our movies because you actually had to act it out rather than have dialogue. Another one of the famous comedians at the time was Fatty Arbuckle. He was one of the most popular silent stars in the 1910s and one of the biggest paid actors in Hollywood, signing a contract in 1920 with Paramount Pictures for $14,000, which would be the equivalent to $181,000 in 2020. I think actors are paid a lot more now. Now, despite his physical size, Arbuckle was remarkably agile and acrobatic. Max Sennett, when recounting his first meeting with Arbuckle, noted that he skipped up the stairs as light as Fred Astaire, and that he was without warning, went into a feather-light step, clapped his hands, and did a backward somersault as gracefully as a girl tumbler. And there was another physical comedian that is very well known for his physical comedy. If you've ever seen some of this, it's like, how did he do that stuff? Here's just one short clip. He was best known for his silent films in which his trademark physical comedy was used. One of the greatest physical comedians of all time, and did many of his stunts by himself, as you can see here. Now we had Clara Bow. She was the first cinematic sex symbol. She was called the It Girl. The It Girl because she had it, whatever it was, that thing, that mysterious thing. And here's another shot of her. And of course, with the great sex symbol, you have to have the girl next door. That was Mary Pickford. She was considered to be the queen of movies. I like to say she's kind of like the Jennifer Aniston of the 1920s. And she was married to this guy who was Douglas Fairbanks. He was the great swashbuckler. He was in all the pirate movies. He starred in The Mark of Zorro. And when the two got married, they were like Hollywood royalty. They bought this big mansion in Hollywood, and they called it Pickfair, a mixture of their names. And everyone who was anyone in Hollywood came to their parties. And you can't talk about the movies without the famous Latin lover, Rudolph Valentino, who was in such silent films such as The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Sheik, The Eagle, The Son of the Sheik. Speaking of the Sheik, here he is. And many women swooned over this man. And he died at an early age, too. And of course, the name of the lecture is The Jazz Age. This was when jazz first came out. And here are some of the most notable folks. This is Jelly Roll Morton. Now, Jelly Roll was, he said he invented jazz. I'll tell you about that in a second. He began his career in a bordello and claimed that in the early 1910s that he actually invented jazz, but a lot of his contemporaries wouldn't have agreed with that. And here we have the King Oliver's Creole Band down in New Jersey. Now, this is one of the best and most important bands of the early age. You can hear a little Dixieland in that. Jazz came out of the New Orleans Dixieland music. And one of their notable players was this man, Louis Armstrong. Satchmo.
The next time we're going to swing for you is one of the good old favorites. That's Dinah. Look out there, boy. Are you ready? Look out there.
And then by the late 20s, jazz started to take on a different look and sound. This is the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. And here's one of the all-time great jazz musicians, George Gershwin, and most famous for his composition Rhapsody in Blue. So in all the 1920s, we had some sensational, famous trials. One that was right here in Massachusetts, the famous Sacco Vanzetti case. This one, you had two Italian immigrants who were radical anarchists. They were arrested for murder and robbery of a paymaster in Braintree, Massachusetts. And the case became a cause célèbre around the world, as you can see from this newsreel footage of them just arriving at court in 1921 after they were arrested. You wouldn't have this kind of coverage on any old trial. So the world was watching. In the end, they were convicted and sentenced to death. The prevalent feeling was that they were innocent and railroaded just because they were Italian and anarchists. And here's a shot of their electrocution that occurred October 23rd, 1927 at Charlestown State Prison in Charlestown, right next to Boston. Here's a shot of their funeral. On Sunday, August 28th, a 2-hour funeral procession bearing a huge floral tribute moved through the city. Thousands of marchers took part in the procession, over 200,000 people. And then there was another critical trial. This was the Scopes monkey trial. The Scopes trial, formerly known as Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, and commonly referred to as the monkey trial, was an American legal case in which a substitute school teacher, John Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach human evolution in any state-funded school. So this is the old argument, creationism versus evolution. And Scopes was just subbing for the day, and this was a setup because this whole thing was planned out so they could try this in a court of law. And the trial was held in a small town of Dayton, Tennessee, where it was held. Scopes was unsure whether he had ever taught evolution, but he purposely incriminated himself so that the case would have a defendant. Now, we had two power lawyers that came to try the case. Now, I don't know how they did this, but William Jennings Bryant was for the prosecution. He's the fellow on the right, a three-time presidential candidate, very conservative, Bible Belt type of gentleman. And his opposition was Clarence Darrow, famed defense attorney who was to defend Scopes. Now, Darrow was a leading member of the ACLU, and he was called a sophisticated country lawyer, and he gave great oration in class. And he actually had Jennings get on the stand and raked him over the coals about what was in the Bible. Was it true or was it not? And he brought out certain things in the Bible that were obviously impossible or crazy. And Jennings actually contradicted himself when he was on the stand. Now, what happened was eventually Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. But the verdict was overturned on a technicality. The trial served its purpose of drawing intense national publicity as national reporters flocked to Dayton to cover the big-name lawyers who had agreed to represent each time. So a discussion about whether to teach evolution started here. Another famous murder case was the Loeb and Leopold case. Now, Nathan Loeb Jr. and Richard Albert Leopold and Loeb, usually referred to collectively by the two, were two wealthy students in the University of Chicago, both extremely intelligent. They read detective magazines. They began to do little crimes and burglaries at first. They imagined themselves superior to everybody else and thought that they could commit the perfect crime. And they came up with a plan to kidnap a boy for ransom, but then kill him. And pretty soon this plan came to fruition. They actually kidnapped this young boy whose name was Bobby Franks. They lured him into their car and they bludgeoned him to death. And then they hid his body in a culvert. And then they sent a ransom note to the parents. Now, they weren't as super intelligent as you might think. The body was found right away. And also, Leopold left his glasses there. And it turns out that pair of glasses was only one of two sets made in Chicago. And they were able to track it to him very quickly. And they ended up being arrested. And before you knew it, they both were copping to the crime. They confessed. And they were brought to trial. Now, the crux of the trial, it turned out to be that they pled guilty. And the drama here was not really the trial as to guilt or innocence. It was Clarence Darrow, who you just met in the last vignette. They brought him in to argue that these two should not be put to death. And he gave this impassioned speech to the judge. They chose to have it done in front of the judge. One person would decide this, as to why these two should not be put to death. And he swayed the judge. He was able to sway the judge. It was a 12-hour-long, masterful plea. Can you imagine sitting there for 12 hours and listening to Clarence Darrow? People had longer attention spans back then. The judge was persuaded to give them life sentences, and both of them were sentenced to life, as you can see here. And then we have the Fatty Arbuckle case. Do you remember Fatty Arbuckle? On September 5th, 1921, Arbuckle took a break from his hectic film schedule. Him and his three friends checked in to a three-room hotel in the St. Francis Hotel, which was in San Francisco, as you see here. And they checked into the room. This is a map of the outlay of the room. Arbuckle and his friend Fishback would share 221, and his other friend Sherman would be in 220 here. And they decided to have a big party. And this is what they did. They invited, several women were invited to the suite. During the carousing, a 26-year-old aspiring actress named Virginia Rapp, or Rappe, was found seriously ill in room 1219 and was examined by the hotel doctor, who concluded that her symptoms were mostly caused by intoxication. He gave her morphine to calm her down. Rappe was not hospitalized until 2 days after the incident. Now, at the hospital, her friend, whose name was Bambina Maud Delamont, usually referred to as Maud Delamont, told the doctor that Arbuckle had raped her friend. The doctor examined Rappe but found no evidence of rape. She died 1 day after her hospitalization from peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder. Now, Delamont later made a statement incriminating Arbuckle to the police in an attempt to extort money from Arbuckle. Delamont told police that Arbuckle had raped Rappe. The police concluded that the impact of Arbuckle's overweight body lying on top of Rappe had eventually caused her bladder to rupture. This is what the room looked like after this great party. Now, Arbuckle was charged with rape, and there were 3 trials. 2 trials. One trial ended in a hung jury, and he would be tried again, and he would be found not guilty. But this scandal ruined his career. He eventually would go in. He couldn't get a job under his own name, and he was able to find work as a director using the name William Goodrich. Now, in 1933, after all this had kind of died down, he was about to make a big comeback. But just before this comeback, he died of a heart attack at the age of 46. Herbert Hoover becomes the president. The Roaring Twenties come to a screeching halt. And you know what happened in 1929. The stock market crashed. Billions of dollars were lost within a day, wiping out thousands of investors. Panic selling reached its peak, some stocks having no buyers at any price. Here's some shots of Wall Street, just the panic on the streets. And this drove the economy into what we now know as the Great Depression. The 20s had come to an end. And back then, this is in the days before government programs. People stood on soup lines to get food. If you wanted a job, you had to go out and really hustle for it. Here's some guys trying to get a job. My own grandfather sold cigarettes on the street corners because he lost his job. I remember stories of them making dandelion salad from the backyard, and these were tough times. So the 1920s had come to a screeching halt, and we entered the time of the Great Depression. And I thank you for having me tonight. All right. Haha. Now, I don't know, are there any questions at all? Yes?
One of the things you didn't talk about that is the commercialization of radio,
Right.
which started in 1920.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how radio got interwoven with the whole?
Oh, yeah, you could say that. That's a good point that you make there, but when you're doing an hour lecture, you can't. That is an excellent point, because now you had this mass form of communication that people were able to connect in a way they never had been before. And really, this is what made the 1920s really the first decade of the 20th century, because we had that technology to connect people. I guess you could even kind of compare it to today's social media in a way, and how that has changed society. I think radio changed society for the good. I don't know about social media, though. Do you have a background in radio?
Family background, yeah.
Yep. Oh. Oh. You don't want to tell us about it?
Oh, sure. My uncle was got into radio very early in the 20s,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually became program director for WNYC in
Oh.
LaGuardia.
Oh, excellent.
Was named years later as the father of public radio.
Right. Wow. Wow.
Large number. So my father was a radio technician when at CBS Television.
Yes.
So I've been interested in radio all my life.
Yes. Very much so. And radio is still going strong. Yep. Even I think the podcasts are kind of bringing back the age of, the old age of the classic radio with the radio shows and dramas and everything. Any other questions at all? Yes.
A revision of this at Lucky Lindy.
Oh, Lucky Lindy as well.
My
Yep.
late brother used to sing the song, Lucky Lindy up in the sky.
Yep.
And she'd say, hey Lindy, give us a ride.
And he used to tour around the country too,
Yeah,
I believe.
be good.
Where I teach down at Silver Lake Regional, he came to the backwater of Halifax, Massachusetts to visit some of the kids at the school there. I think I want to say they even had like a model of the Spirit of St. Louis that he would bring around with him. Yeah, yeah. That's great. Okay, I guess we're through. All right, everybody. Bye-bye.